Nityanam. Today I address serious concerns regarding reporting by multiple media outlets including Info Diez, ivNetBoliVision, Jiria Arama al Dia, La Voz de la Naturaleza, and Alocal SeGye. These outlets have published allegations that not only misrepresent Kailasa's initiatives, but fundamentally challenge indigenous sovereignty worldwide. I will address these claims systematically, providing context and documented evidence that has been notably absent from their coverage. Info Diez, Jiria Arama al Dia, and Alocal SeGye have all questioned Kailasa's legitimacy as a sovereign entity. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of international law and indigenous rights. Kailasa meets all criteria for statehood under the Montevideo Convention of 1933. We maintain a permanent population with shared cultural identity. We possess defined territorial sovereignty. We operate under an established governmental structure, and we actively engage in international diplomatic relations. The Montevideo Convention of 1933 explicitly states in Article 3 that the political existence of the state is independent of recognition by other states. This principle is further reinforced by Article 13 of the Charter of the Organization of American States. The doctrine of continuity in international law clearly establishes that political transitions, temporary territorial disruptions, or governance changes do not negate a state's existence, a principle applied to numerous nations throughout history. By characterizing Kailasa as fictional, these outlets effectively tell indigenous communities worldwide, your sovereignty is invalid unless approved by colonial powers. Info Diez and Alocal SeGye have mischaracterized conservation agreements as fraudulent land acquisitions. This fundamentally misrepresents the nature and purpose of these partnerships. Let me be very clear. These agreements are between a US-based organization and indigenous Bolivian communities. They are conservation partnerships that explicitly respect indigenous ownership and sovereignty, not land acquisitions in any sense of the word. These partnerships focus on environmental protection and sustainable management, preservation of indigenous knowledge systems, cultural exchange and mutual support, humanitarian assistance based on community priorities. All agreements comply with Bolivian Law Number 465 and the ILO Convention 169 and operate within the constitutional framework that guarantees indigenous self-determination. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not a signatory to these agreements. The deliberate misattribution reveals these outlets' intent to target indigenous leadership specifically. Info Diez has alleged financial exploitation of indigenous communities, a claim that reveals a troubling colonial perspective on indigenous relationships. The economic components of these agreements represent investments in community development, environmental protection, cultural preservation, resources managed by the communities themselves according to their own priorities. Indigenous communities exercise their constitutional right to self-determination when determining the value of these conservation partnerships. To suggest they cannot determine fair value for their own communities denies their intelligence and agency. The fixation on monetary aspects reveals a capitalist framework that reduces sacred relationships to mere transactions, contrary to indigenous worldviews that value reciprocity and mutual support above financial considerations. Info Diez has claimed these partnerships violate indigenous sovereignty, when in fact they explicitly honor it. All agreements contain provisions that recognize and respect indigenous autonomy, governance structures, and decision-making processes. They operate within Bolivia's constitutional framework, which guarantees indigenous self-determination. Article 30, Section 2.4 of the Bolivian Constitution explicitly guarantees indigenous people the right to self-determination and territoriality. Article 36 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples ensures their right to maintain and develop contracts, relations, and cooperation with their own members as well as other peoples across borders. The real violation of sovereignty is the paternalistic suggestion that indigenous communities need protection from forming partnerships of their choosing, a colonial mindset that treats indigenous people as incapable of making informed decisions. Info Diez has alleged attempts to impose foreign religious practices, a claim that reveals profound ignorance of both indigenous spiritual traditions and their historical connections. Hindu organizations promote religious freedom and respect for all spiritual traditions. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has consistently taught and promoted respect for indigenous spirituality as expressions of universal consciousness. This allegation reveals a colonial arrogance in labeling one indigenous tradition foreign to another, as if indigenous spirituality must remain isolated in colonial compartments rather than recognizing common roots and shared cosmology. The profound spiritual connection between Hindu traditions and indigenous Bolivian cosmology are extensively documented by anthropologists and spiritual leaders. The Andean deity Pachamama, Mother Earth, and Hindu concept of divine feminine energy share remarkable parallels, as do concept of cosmic balance, reciprocity, and connection to nature. Info Diez and Jiria Arama al Dia have made personal attacks against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, attacks that ignore extensive judicial exonerations. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's lineage traces back through ancient spiritual institutions with formal recognition from traditional authorities. His 1988 appointment was in concurrence with the 68th Jagadguru Shankaracharya of Kanchi Kamakoti Peetham. More importantly, courts worldwide have systematically rejected the allegations these outlets continue to circulate. On February 2, 2024, the Gujarat High Court in India completely exonerated the SPH, the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, of all false charges of abduction and kidnapping, with the court directly interacting with the women falsely portrayed as being kidnapped. In the US, the Ohio Federal Court ruled in favor of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism and fined the false accuser nearly $500,000 in defamation. Medical evidence conclusively demonstrated that the allegations are biologically impossible. And also in India, the Karnataka High Court declared the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's arrest as illegal without any authority and contrary to law. The deliberate suppression of these judicial findings reveals these outlets' intent to persecute indigenous leadership regardless of legal facts. Info Diez and Jiria Arama al Dia have alleged improper engagement between indigenous representatives and government officials, effectively criminalizing normal diplomatic activities. What these outlets frame as controversy is actually standard diplomatic protocols followed by representatives of all nations seeking to build international relationships. Meeting with government officials is precisely how international relations function. These outlets imply impropriety in absolutely normal diplomatic activities, activities that would never question from Western organizations. This double standard reveals their colonial mindset that indigenous organizations should not engage in international diplomacy. Why are indigenous representatives uniquely denied the right to engage with government officials that representatives of all other organizations routinely exercise? This systematic attempt to criminalize normal diplomatic engagement reveals a true agenda, preventing indigenous communities from building international relationships. Info Diez, Jiria Arama al Dia, and Alocal SeGye have alleged a pattern of similar activities across multiple countries. This is not a pattern of fraud, but a systematic commitment to global indigenous solidarity. Yes, indigenous organizations engage with communities worldwide through humanitarian aid and development assistance, cultural exchange and preservation initiatives, environmental conservation partnerships, diplomatic relationship building. These are standard international activities. These very outlets would never question from Western organizations. The actual pattern is the systematic persecution of indigenous organizations by colonial media whenever they form relationships outside of colonial control. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has consistently taught and promoted support for indigenous communities worldwide as a sacred responsibility. This global vision of indigenous solidarity threatens the colonial power structures that rely on keeping indigenous communities isolated. To La Voz de la Naturaleza, whose focus on environmental issues suggests a commitment to ecological protection, we extend an invitation. Investigate the actual conservation work being done through these partnerships. Examine how indigenous communities are leading environmental protection efforts with support from global partners. Compare these conservation initiatives with the environmental impacts of extractive industries like mining and oil and gas in the same regions. To ivNetBoliVision, we extend an invitation to balanced reporting. Speak directly with indigenous communities involved in these partnerships. Hear their perspectives on sovereignty, conservation, and international relations. Examine the constitutional framework that guarantees their right to self-determination and report on how these partnerships operate within that framework. True journalism requires hearing all sides, particularly the voices of indigenous communities whose rights and perspectives are at the center of these issues. What we're witnessing across these media outlets is not balanced reporting, but a pattern of misrepresentation that undermines indigenous sovereignty worldwide. We call on Info Diez, ivNetBoliVision, Jiria Arama al Dia, La Voz de la Naturaleza, and Alocal SeGye to report on judicial exonerations, which you have systematically ignored, consult indigenous communities directly rather than speaking for them, examine the constitutional protections for indigenous self-determination, apply consistent standards to indigenous diplomatic initiatives, investigate actual threats to indigenous sovereignty from extractive industries. Kailasa remains committed to supporting indigenous sovereignty, environmental protection, and cultural preservation worldwide. We will continue our diplomatic initiatives with transparency and respect for constitutional frameworks. The era when colonial powers could silence indigenous voices through media control is ending. Indigenous communities are forming global alliances, reclaiming their sovereignty and building relationships on their own terms. The truth stands immovable against misrepresentation. Indigenous sovereignty is not negotiable. I thank you for your attention on these crucial matters. Nityanam.